What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guests in today's episode are Roger Hurst and Jacob Shapiro. Roger is the managing editor of Real Vision Creative Studios, and Jacob is partner and director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. They are both part of a small and highly talented team of content creators at financial media company Lykion, where they co-author a monthly research publication focused on the converging worlds of geopolitics and macro. We spend the first hour of our conversation today discussing the move away from unipolarity towards multipolarity, the forces that are bringing it about, and its impact on global security, international trade, and commerce. And we spend the second hour discussing what all of this means for the economy and market opportunities for investors, what it means for inflation, the bull case for commodities, investment opportunities in emerging markets, central bank policy, and much more. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second half of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your phone using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. Lastly, because this conversation deals with investing, I want to make absolutely clear that nothing I say on this episode can or should be viewed as financial advice. All opinions expressed by me and my guests are solely our own opinions and should not be relied upon as the basis for financial decisions. And with that, please enjoy this truly awesome and informative conversation with my guests, Roger Hurst and Jacob Shapiro. Jacob Shapiro and Roger Hurst, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Welcome and good to see you.
Happy New Year. Cheers.
It's great to see you guys. Yeah, Happy New Year. That's right. We're recording this on January 2nd. I hope you guys had a good New Year. So before we start, guys, I'd love for you to take an opportunity to introduce yourselves and maybe let our listeners know what you're good at, what you're particularly qualified to talk about, and how you got to be qualified in those things.
Shall I kick it off then?
Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead, Roger.
So I have been working at a place called Real Vision for the last 5 years, which is basically video, subscription, etc. But before that, I had over 2 decades working in sales and trading at investment banks, the likes of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, where I covered mainly macro hedge funds and long-short equity hedge funds, but also multi-asset accounts. Really, basically, I was a sort of a macro strategist, multi-asset salesperson, really looking at all global markets, really with a focus on equities. I built up some significant kind of equity businesses around Delta One products, which is things like sector trading, so telecoms, technology sector, stuff like that. And that was really my sort of bread and butter for sort of 20 odd years, and really just sort of shooting the wind, as it were, on all things macro. And that's really where I got into the Real Vision gig from, in that one of the founding partners of Real Vision was someone who I worked with at Goldman Sachs.
Great. And So I sort of stumbled backwards into geopolitics, which is what I do at the end of the day. And I was a colleague of Peter Zeihan's back at Stratfor over a decade ago. I listened to the episode you did with Peter, Dimitri, and I thought it was really good. But so I've been doing geopolitics for basically the past decade. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. So we use geopolitics to actually manage money and use geopolitical insights to position our clients for opportunities and risks there. And then I also work directly with a small number of companies, helping them deal with geopolitics in their supply chains and their future strategies and things like that. And then like Jan, which is where I'm the geopolitics editor, is trying to bring some of those high level insights to a broader audience because it is becoming so much more important. When I was doing geopolitics, when I just started in Austin, like 2009, 2010, it was boring. Nobody cared about geopolitics. If I went to the bar and tried to chat up a girl and said, hey, I do geopolitics, they would glaze over and not want anything to do with me. It's been strange in sort of the last 12 months to be the prettiest person at the ball, and everybody wants to talk about geopolitics all of a sudden, but it's been around for a long time and it's what I do.
You know, that reminds me of a conversation I had with you. You're right. Peter Zeihan has been on the show actually twice. Once back in 2018 or 2019, whenever it was. It was before, or it was right before COVID. So maybe it was right in the beginning of 2020. And then once again recently, I had a conversation with Daniel Dresner, who I think has a PhD in foreign affairs, international relations theory, whatever. But he had written at the time, this was in 2017, he'd written a book on, it was called The Ideas Industry, and it basically looked to create a framework around thought leadership and intellectualism and really to draw distinctions between the two. And we talked about this because I do remember in the early 2000s that it was, the foreign policy people were kind of rock stars because we were, 2001 was the 9/11 attacks. And then there was the whole run up to the war. So all the media outlets were looking for geopolitics experts on foreign relations, maybe less geopolitics, more just foreign affairs and American foreign policy and the Middle East, of course. And then with the 2008 financial crisis, that shifted to guys like Roger, and what feels like now is I 100% agree. I feel like the pendulum is shifting again. But what's really interesting about what you guys are doing is you combine both of those things. And that's actually why I wanted to bring you both on here, because I've been a reader of Lykion. I don't know how you guys would pronounce it, for several years. I'm a huge fan of what you guys do. And I saw that you're putting out a new research service on what you guys are calling the converging worlds of macro and geopolitics. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing there and how you're trying to address a market opportunity that you were speaking to right now, Jacob.
Sure. Well, I'll go first, and Roger, maybe you can fill in any blanks that I don't get wrong. So as you can kind of tell, Roger and I come from very different backgrounds, from very different intellectual frameworks for how we approach the world. Roger comes from a very macro sort of perspective, and I come from that geopolitical perspective. What you said, Dimitri, about the foreign policy guys being the rock stars in the early 2000s, I lived that. I went to university and majored in Middle Eastern studies and thought I was going to graduate, speaking Arabic, and everybody was going to be interested. And by the time I graduated, it was 2008 financial crisis, and they only wanted to talk to guys like Roger. But I think that's a great example of exactly what we're trying to do. So everybody threw the baby out with the bathwater. And in this multipolar world that we're entering going forward, if you want to understand how markets are moving, you have to be able to understand the macro with Roger's level of expertise, but you also have to understand what's happening at a political level. Sometimes the politics will actually defer to the macro. Sometimes the macro will defer to the politics. And it's a really different environment than the early 2000s when you had a bunch of foreign policy gurus going around, because then it really was sort of the American hegemonic moment. There was no challenger to the United States that really meant anything in terms of military capacity or economic influence and power. That's why nobody used geopolitics, because geopolitics is a framework for understanding how nations compete with each other. In a world like we're living in today, where we're seeing global competition all over the place, literal wars in Europe, trade policies that are bringing China to its knees, all these different things, that's what geopolitics was absolutely designed to understand. So the way I think about it, geopolitics helps you understand power and where power is and how it intersects with markets. What Roger's doing is helping you understand what's actually happening in markets, because those have forces completely of their own that sometimes don't even pay attention to what's happening on in the politics. And in those concentric circles in the middle, we're trying to provide some insights to people who are reading.
Yeah, and I think, just to add to that, I think what we had was geopolitics without the markets back in 2000. But markets and macro was still very, very exciting. .com, you had obviously the Asia crisis, etc. And then you sort of had markets, but without the geopolitics. But in some ways, I'd say that 2008 was almost the day that the macro died, because then you just had this boring convergence for the next 10 years where macro mattered less within markets in the same way that geopolitics mattered less. But I think now these are converging into something which is really very, very exciting.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was trying to find some way to think about it. I was thinking about it exclusively in the domain of geopolitics and foreign affairs, which is that the unipolar moment created this stability in the international framework. And you were able to focus on markets exclusively while at the same time making many more assumptions than you normally would. But it's interesting also because that intersected with the Great Moderation and this period of time where central banks had really become stewards of global economies. And so we kind of reached the pinnacle of, I guess, I don't know how you would describe it, what efficiency in market efficiency? I don't know that doesn't feel correct. I mean, how would you describe that moment that we reached, and when was that period that we reached?
Well, I think it's
the zenith, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in that what we saw is that we saw monetary as the stabilizing mechanism. We saw that as in primacy in terms of markets. And what that meant was, as we've seen with the US Federal Reserve, all they really cared about was growth. This period of moderation, which I always say is really 1985 to 2020, 2022 maybe, was all they cared about was growth, therefore interest rates and latterly QE. But it was monetary in the ascendancy. And if you had a global growth spat, the Federal Reserve was interested in trying to reverse a slowdown in growth. So they were always out there helping to support global growth, which is why you almost had this convergence of policy into what ultimately became something relatively narrow in terms of market opportunities. But certainly I would agree that it really accelerated post-1997, really after the dot-com. And then, in the lead up to the great financial crisis, that was monetary policy on steroids that eventually allowed excesses to take over, with then the QE coming to save the day once more.
Yeah, and I left out globalization. I mean, globalization is what made the savings available in the first place. It's what brought down inflation and what gave room to central bankers to juice asset prices and smoothen out the business cycle. Is that kind of the framing you were getting at?
Well, that's exactly what I was going to chime in and say, which is the way that I would look at it from my perspective is we hit peak globalization. And in some ways, we hit peak globalization in the 2008 financial crisis. One of my favorite anecdotes that I lead off with when I'm talking to audiences is, what happened when the U.S. understood that they had the subprime mortgage crisis on their hands. One of their first calls was to their colleagues at the People's Bank of China so that they could coordinate exactly what was happening in terms of monetary policy and make sure that contagion didn't go so far. If you juxtapose that with what happened with the COVID-19, at the time it was an epidemic, not a pandemic yet. There's a threat that doesn't care whether we're Chinese or American or British or anything else. The virus kills us all the same. And yet, for political reasons, China was not willing to call the United States and say, hey, we've got this virus on our hands. We have no idea what to do with. The United States was not willing to work with China after the virus was spreading around in terms of vaccines and in terms of personal protective equipment. We had that phrase vaccine diplomacy everywhere. So I think for me, it's peak globalization hits around 2008, and we are just slowly beginning to unwind that. And you mentioned in terms of market efficiency. Market efficiency was also, we were getting efficient in making things, in trading things. It's why you have a situation where Taiwan manufactures all the semiconductors in the world, which, South Korea has a component of that, and Japan has a component of that. All these different countries going towards comparative advantage, driving down the cost of goods, specializing in one thing because the US protects the whole global trading system. As that goes out the door, you're seeing all those things unravel.
Yeah, the way I've thought about it is, I totally agree, is a continuum where, let's say, the left side of the distribution is resiliency or redundancy, and the right side is efficiency. And we've been able to select for efficiency because a lot of the conditions that would normally force us to pick resiliency have been there. Largely the United States, the unipolar moment, the security guarantee, the international rules-based order. When do you guys feel like we began to visibly move away from that period of unipolarity? And then I would love to kind of get a sense of where you guys stand in terms of what is the new order that's coming into being. Is it even possible or useful to talk about it as bipolarity or multipolarity, or is it something kind of like a mix between the two or the three?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting academic exercise to try and pinpoint exactly when globalization crested, but it is somewhat of an academic exercise. But let's go through it because I do think it's helpful. For me, there's a couple different ones that I would point to. The first you could point to is another Russian invasion, because what happens in 2008, along with the financial crisis, Russia invades Georgia. Now, they get their butts kicked. Nobody really knows that because Georgia is so small and because Russia was able to recover, but we're seeing a lot of those things happen. But that was Russia announcing to the world, hey, we're back. We're not cool with the United States. Fast forward a couple of years, a lot of people would, I think, pick the Trump trade war with China. I would locate that a couple years beforehand because the Obama administration started picking on China around 2014. If you were in the U.S. tire industry or in the U.S. poultry industry, you know what I'm talking about because the Obama administration slapped some tariffs on China around those specific industries, and China retaliated on U.S. poultry around that same time. For me, that was the first sort of signal that, hey, there's a trade conflict here brewing. It doesn't matter who's going to come to power next. Somebody's going to have to deal with this. But then, we could go to Brexit is sort of a potential sign. The trade war itself breaks out with Trump too. The COVID-19 pandemic and that lack of international coordination, you could date it there. I think the nail was in the coffin when Russia invaded Ukraine. I mean, that's where you can say you can't argue about it anymore. We're definitely past that period. So I think that's the definitive moment. But I think you could make a case for any of the moments that I just talked about. And there are probably a few that I'm forgetting. It's important to remember that even during the unipolar moment, there were blips all the time of challenges to unipolarity. Geopolitics is never static. These things never sort of stay the same. So you can pick any points you want. But the final answer I would tell you is it was for sure over with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
To add to that, from sort of more the economic perspective, I think we went through over the last decade, but to the back end of the last decade, we went peak monetary. Not saying the best, I'm saying peak in terms of its influence, and also peak China. And again, what I mean by that is Chinese growth in terms of how it spread out to the rest of the world. And I think I always look at 2018 for China as being an interesting point where they started to look away from growth at any cost and just building things and looking more at shoring up their own internal financial system, which changed very much the dynamics from every time you saw China doing credit growth, you always bought commodities. Well, suddenly that changed in 2018. And a lot of the big emerging market exporters started to slow relative to things like the US. And obviously, as we went through the last decade in terms of the US, peak monetary being we're at the zero bound, we're doing QE upon QE. And it was very clear that financial markets loved that opioid injection from that monetary. So I think those two came together probably within a couple of years of each other between 2015 and 2020. So that suddenly, as we came towards COVID and then as we came towards Russia and Ukraine, you'd already seen these two peaks now behind us.
Yeah, I would probably, you're right, Jacob. It is kind of an academic exercise and there is no way to choose one and definitively support it. But I kind of would either go with the 2008 invasion of Georgia or Putin's speech at the Munich conference in 2007. Here's a question that I don't hear people ask, and it literally just came to me as you were answering this question, both of you, which is, what are the causes of the decline of unipolarity? I think a lot of people might simply assume that it is the rise of China or the relative decline in military strength between the U.S. and some of these other countries, but I actually think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here first again as well, which goes to your point before about what framework can we say that we're in right now. And I just put out a forecast piece on the CI side that's available if people want to read that as well. And I just picked a Twitter fight with Marco Papic before we got on this call because I saw him just talking about multipolarity and it's now a multipolar framework and you can't argue that it's anything else. That's the trajectory that we're on for sure. But the current environment I really think is a transitional phase because if you actually look at what's going on in the world, aspects of unipolarity, they still abound everywhere. We saw the dollar run up this year. I think the dollar might have some more legs, although I'd be curious to get Roger's take on that sort of in the year ahead. But the dollar was showing you just how powerful the United States still is. The United States is a net energy exporter, showing you how powerful the United States still is. Russia invaded Ukraine this year. The biggest part of the story of Russia invading Ukraine is that Russia's getting beat. They're getting their face ripped off. And now China's afraid of doing anything with Taiwan because they understand, God, if Russia can't even deal with Ukraine, can we deal with Taiwan? In the meantime, our growth is being crippled by these US semiconductor restrictions that they're enlisting the Dutch and they're enlisting the Japanese. Suddenly, the unipolar framework seems to be responding. So I think there's still aspects of unipolarity in the system. There are even some aspects of bipolarity in the system until Europe can metabolize its energy crisis. The two dominant economies are the United States and China. And so those countries are sort of squaring off on an economic level. But I think if you're looking forward at that new order, it really is, I think we're moving towards that multipolar world order. And I think most people would answer your question in terms of, oh, the United States is in decline and China is ascending. I don't think that at all. I think the United States has sort of treading water and self-absorbed. We care more about our own politics than just about anything else. That's a normal American way of being. If you look back at US history, Russia's clearly a declining power. Europe is not quite sure what it wants to be. If you told me it collapsed, I can make the argument for that. If you told me it came together as a new world power, could make an argument for that. And then you have little middle powers all over the place, like Brazil, like India, like Japan and Australia, that are thinking, okay, what aspects of the unipolar system can we preserve and what aspects can we make better? Turkey, I also should have thrown into that sort of middle power bucket as well. So it's the presence of all of these different countries that don't necessarily think the system is in their best interest, and they have just enough power, just enough imagination to say, okay, we're going to push on the system a little bit to try and make it a little bit better for us. Whereas 20 years ago, you couldn't do that. Everybody wanted to be in the WTO. Everybody wanted to be the United States' best friend. Everybody wanted to be the next Asian tiger economic growth miracle. We're moving away from that being what people want.
Yeah, Roger, I want you to answer. I also want to say, yes, I agree. I think of it as like unipolar-ish or quasi-multipolar with a bipolar bent, because obviously the US and China are the most dominant powers. Roger, do you have any thoughts on that? And then I wanted to add something to it.
Yes, I think what we've been seeing is the end of a demographic dividend for a lot of regions. So, for instance, it was in everybody's sort of mutual benefit for the US to outsource a lot of its productive capacity to other regions which were sort of in the initial phases of growing. But what effectively you've done is you've sort of squeezed the juice out of that. Where is the advantage now for the US? In fact, what we saw the US doing was thinking about, okay, have we outsourced too much of this? Have we lost our own growth engine? And the problem with the demographic dividend having run out is that, where does productivity really come from? It's basically demographic growth, it's population growth. So with that slowing down for a lot of countries, or people realizing, a lot of countries realizing that demographic benefit is going to come to an end probably in the next decade. And obviously these are very slow moving. I think people have started to look around for, okay, where do we reset growth? And it's a reset of that growth because of the end of that demographic dividend. And I think a lot of the countries that Jacob was talking about are probably the ones that still have the tailwind behind them going forward, whereas those that don't are having to rethink their models because they can't scratch each other's backs anymore.
I mean, Turkey is a great example of that. Turkey is a subject that we've covered on the show. I think we've devoted at least 3 specific episodes to Turkey, and strong demographics are a huge part of their long-term advantage. Where do you guys rank some of the distributional problems associated with globalization? That, in other words, globalization did not distribute the gains from this move away from resiliency and towards efficiency evenly. And I would actually say that the force of globalization exacerbated internal wealth inequities within countries. This is something that we've explored on various episodes as well. The most immediate one that comes to mind is our episode with Michael Pettis. It seems to me that irrespective of what would be happening on a great power level, the way that things were moving globally and economically, we would have seen. Now, the question is, how would this have impacted unipolarity? I don't quite know. But I think we would have seen some major issues within countries as a result of globalization that may have challenged the ability of the unipolar moment to take hold, because ultimately it would have required a kind of governing consensus at the national level to be able to work internationally. I'm curious how you guys see that. I mean, how would the forces of globalization and the maldistribution of wealth and income have made it difficult to have an effective and sustainable global market economy built around a rules-based international order like what George H.W. Bush had put forward in the early 1990s?
Well, what I'll do is I'll do a very, very quick summary of what I think is happening, and then let Jacob kind of put the meat on it, because my very simplistic framework of that sort of inequality story really is that post-war to 1980, Labour was in the ascendancy. And then you effectively had Reaganomics, Thatcher coming in, going to a free market economy, which is the monetary economy, as it were, particularly in the developed markets. And I think that we're now seeing potentially that shift back towards Labour. And I think this is the interesting point, because a shift back towards Labour is a political move rather than a market move. So this is where I think we are today. Are we seeing the reverse of that 1980 moment of it was unions, it was Labour in the ascendancy, then it was capital in the ascendancy? Are we now going back to Labour because with capital in the ascendancy, you had the massive inequality? And I think that's the very simplistic framework that I use to sort of explain where I think we've come from, where we're going, and why I think it was unsustainable. Because within countries, that inequality is going to cause the sort of navel gazing that means that people will want to bring things back to their borders and break down those relations.
Can I ask a question real quick, though? So, I agree with that general framing, that dichotomy between labor and capital, and I agree with how you sequenced it. But is it possible that yes, we went from labor to capital, but that instead of going from capital back to labor, that what we're going to see is the state and states in general, nation states and governments, take more and more of the pie of the economy this time around? And that also speaks to the technological moment that we're in and the way in which a lot of these technologies scale in a manner that allocates capital to smaller and smaller hands. And therefore, you need a larger state to redistribute those gains. And I don't quite know what framework I would think about, but it feels more feudalistic.
I would actually, it's a nice way of putting it. So again, if I take that same framework, I can say it was post-war to 1980, it was fiscal, then it became monetary. Are we going back to fiscal, i.e. more government for exactly those reasons? The government's going to have a bigger hand, redistribution of wealth, but it's government, i.e. fiscal. So fiscal, monetary, are we going back to fiscal?
Got it.
Yeah, and what I would add there is, because there's really two parts of what you laid out there, Dimitri. There is inequality between nations, and then there is inequality in nations. So if we're talking about between nations, China was the biggest benefactor of globalization because it was the most efficient. It could do things at scale and with a ruthlessness that no other country in the world could really do. And the losers of that were countries like Mexico, like Brazil, these parts of the world that thought they were going to enjoy the benefits of globalization. But if you were a company in the late 1990s, early 2000s, you wanted to be in China. And you wanted to be in China for good reasons, because there wasn't this idea that China was going to be a threat to the United States. And the Chinese just did things better and cheaper and more reliably than just about anybody else. So I think there's this inequality between nations that we see cropping up. You see countries like Turkey, like Brazil, like Mexico saying like, hey, we got a raw deal here. We want some of the benefits of globalization too. All these things that you sent to China, why don't you bring them to us? Why don't we all sort of share in those benefits? And we can have trade blocks around different political alignments that go there too. In terms of inside countries, though, I think you're exactly right, and we've seen it. And to what you and Roger were just talking about in terms of capital and labor, again, that's going to vary hugely depending on what type of domestic system a country has. So if you're in an authoritarian system, if you're in a China or in a Russia, then yes, the dictator can just say the state will have more control and we will redistribute wealth from one place to the other. Putin's already been doing this in the war. Xi Jinping is trying to do this as well too. We'll see if he succeeds, but he's running into some problems there in doing that redistribution. In democracies, it's not really clear exactly what's going to happen, and I don't think we can generalize. What we can say is that the large levels of inequality that we're seeing in a lot of these liberalized markets led to the rise of populists. And some populists might promise more state control for redistribution. Some populists might promise deregulation and slash and all these other things. Some will promise one thing and do something else when they get into power. So I think you'll see coherence out of authoritarian regimes that can snap their fingers and move some of these things around. But in democracies, we're still having these squabbles. We're still arguing amongst ourselves. And it's not exactly clear who's going to take power and what policies they're actually going to be able to apply to deal with some of these things. So I'm not comfortable saying, that in the West or in democracies, we are just moving towards state control. It's all up for grabs right now. That's what the sort of political tug of war is right now. And it's really important to see what issues are important in what countries and what flavor of populist has power at a particular point. And if they ever have a tipping point where they can really control the government in general.
I agree with that. We really are in a populist moment. It's not just politicians. There are corporate chieftains that have entered the fray and have really taken on the vestures of the populist leader. Elon Musk is the classic example. How do you think about, you do a great job actually in your writings talking about how the word geopolitics, and I'm probably as guilty as anyone for misusing it, it's such a sexier word than IR or foreign affairs. So, but how do you think about the forces of geopolitics as we consider them in terms of nation states as being the legitimate actors in the world, in this world where corporations and increasingly individuals at the helms of corporations are very powerful and are able to transcend national boundaries? This is an extension of what we saw, with the unfettering of capital in the late 1990s. Is there some way to incorporate large multinationals in your framework? Like, are they themselves, in a sense, becoming geopolitical actors? Again, I'm putting quotes around geopolitical.
No, the first thing I want to say is that the 19th century Swedish and German and British intellectuals who came up with geopolitics are probably quite surprised to know that their thoughts are sexy in the 21st century. I'm sure that's something they didn't think. And if you read their very boring, dry work that laid the foundations, it's not very sexy at all. That's the sort of tough stuff you have to do to get up to speed with it. Geopolitics at its purest form, it's just a framework for understanding, again, relations between states. And it tries to strip out ideology and just say, okay, what are the interests at play here and how are those different countries going going to go against their interests. I've had many conversations with fellow analysts who debate whether you can apply that framework outside of the nation state. Purists will tell you no. Geopolitics was invented to explain relations between nation states. And if you start applying it, whether it's to a multinational company or to a group like the Islamic State or some other non-state actor, can you really do the same thing? I would err on the side of yes, but I would also tell you that this is where geopolitics is fundamentally limited, and why I work with companies like CI, or why I work with Roger at Lyceon, because you really need that alternate perspective. Sometimes geopolitics is not going to matter. Sometimes it's not the most important thing. Sometimes a multinational company will matter more than a government, will have more of the leverage than a government. We've seen the rise of city-states, the rise and fall of city-states throughout global history. We're going to have some more city-states, I think, here around this time too, because the way that the current system is going, if you're a Singapore, for instance, the deck looks pretty good for you. If you can figure out exactly how to balance between these different sectors and be the place where everybody else wants to be and not go to one side or the other, suddenly you have sort of a key linchpin and you can be a city-state in that sense. So I would say, yes, you can apply geopolitics to multinationals and to city-states and to all these other non-state actors, but I would do it with a grain of salt, because if geopolitics is the only tool in your toolkit, you'll get it wrong. You've got to know what's going on with markets. You've got to know culturally what's going on the ground. You've got to know whether it's populism or authoritarianism, this, that, and the other thing. So it's the sum is the greater than the parts here. You need geopolitics to understand that, but if you only understand that, you'll kind of miss the boat.
Yeah. You know, the EU came to mind for me when we were talking about the spoils of globalization and their distribution, because Europe kind of finds itself in this funny middle. It benefited from globalization. It benefited from the unipolar. I mean, the EU is an evolution of treaties and organizations that began in the 1950s, but it has benefited from the trends that we've talked about. But at the same time, it's a political union, and so the spoils were kind of distributed also on a nationwide basis, which resulted in a lot of these kind of resentments from the north to the south and post-2008. Let's put a pin in that conversation and start maybe with Ukraine, because Ukraine has been like the single most important. I mean, I'm trying to think, is there anything else that, I mean, the Fed, it was foreseeable, the Fed's tightening stance in 2021, more foreseeable, so to speak, than the invasion of Ukraine. A lot of geopolitical analysts missed it. I'm happy to say that we had people on like Dmitry Alperovich in December 2021 for an episode titled "Why Putin is Going to Invade Ukraine." So we were covering it, and I actually think we did a good job. I'm taking a moment to toot our own horn here. A good job of really pointing out what we thought at the time was, and what I thought was, the Biden administration really stepping up its game on the information war and trying to redefine and set the stage for people having an awareness of what was going on, because the disinformation landscape is such a big part of how these wars are waged, and Russia has really had a leg up on the U.S. for a long time. So Ukraine's a big deal. It's been a huge deal in 2022. But I also wonder to myself, okay, looking 10, 20 years from now, if I look back, is Ukraine going to be the thing that people remember about that as the defining thing, like the 2003 invasion of Iraq? And my sense is no, it's not. But it's been a really big deal today, and it's focusing so much attention and resources, and it is having this kind of catalytic effect on European integration or unity, or it may. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So what is the significance of the Ukraine war? And maybe even before, what's the significance? Where are we at this stage of the conflict? And what's the significance of this conflict in both of your views?
Yeah, it's too early to tell, because if Ukraine, if the Ukrainian war goes so badly that Putin either gets thrown out of office or Russia devolves in a Russian Revolution type scenario, and then in 5 years we're talking about Ukrainian accession to the European Union, then yes, we will definitely be talking about this as a transformative moment, because the European Union just became a major power and finally defeated Russia, and Russia's going to fall apart all over itself, a country with 100 million people and nuclear weapons running around everywhere. Like, it could be totally huge. If, on the other hand, the Europeans get weak in the knees and they see Putin is starting to soften on, we'll take the foreign currency now for natural gas payments, which he said, a couple days ago. If they start to see, we can actually have some kind of accommodation with Russia, Ukraine, you really have to make that accommodation, and we get into some kind of frozen conflict type scenario, or if, God forbid, Russia succeeds, if it's just able to grind out a victory over time, because eventually, Ukraine's brave defenders, they can't fight forever, and they are numerically outnumbered. They're dependent on the United States and European powers sending them weapons. If the weapons run out, or if the political will runs out, and the Russians do what they always do in wars, which is just grind it out and outlast them, and they're able to reintegrate most of Ukraine into Russia, well, then it's probably not something we're going to talk about very much either. It's one of the reasons that geopolitical analysts like me hate these type of conflicts once they start out. They're terrible for lots of different reasons, but they're also terrible because they're impossible to predict in the moment. You said that you had some guys on the podcast that predicted the war effectively. I whiffed. I totally missed. But now that I missed, I have enough humility to say, it could go either way here right now. So the things that you really need to watch for are that European and US will, political will, for supporting the Ukrainians going forward. Because for as brave and as really skilled as the Ukrainian defense has been, they can't make their own weapons. So if they can't get weapons from the United States, if they can't get weapons and support from the Europeans, then maybe we're not talking about something that is that important in a grand scheme of things. But if it leads to some of those other scenarios, which are completely on the table and which I would tell you are more likely, even with a low confidence interval in that, then yes, we will absolutely talk about this as one of the major moments in time. Just one other thought to throw in there. I will say that Russia seems to always be the thing that they always do something at these transformational moments. You know, there's the Russia-Japanese War in the late 1800s, which really leads to the rise of Japan and eventually to the fall of the Tsar, and the Russian Revolution, which then leads to the rise of global communism. The collapse of the Soviet Union leads to the unipolar moment. In some sense, that sort of Mackinder idea that the heartland, the geopolitical heartland in Eurasia is the most important thing. It seems when Russia wobbles like this, it affects the world in ways that people in the moment couldn't even really see. So I'm also struck by the fact that here we are again with Russia for a fourth time in sort of the last 100 years, and they've done something that's going to change things. So 3 previous times, you would have been right in saying the Russian thing did affect global history going forward. So that's the best I can do right now with an active war ongoing in Europe.
Let's let Roger respond, but then I want to come back to you, Jacob, and then maybe back to Roger again, because I want to know what you think some of those possible outcomes of the wobble might be. I'm curious, things that people aren't talking about. But anyway, Roger, go ahead. And feel free to answer that as well in your response, Roger.
Well, I think, the sort of profound implications of many of the alternative scenarios Jacob talked about there are, beyond me in terms of adding anything to them. For me, the main thing here has always been, has there been a structural response from Europe in terms of sourcing energy? How much will that cost over the next few years? Because to make the sort of changes that Europe is currently trying to do will take probably half a decade minimum because of the size of the infrastructure spend. Is that going to be a drag? Is that going to reshape the way that Europe has been doing business? And in particular, the primacy that Germany has had as an industrial heartland to Europe, where it has had all the advantages of the currency. It has had the advantage of being able to supply itself, or not supply itself, but take in relatively cheap sources of energy, and is a significant per capita user of energy within Europe. So for me, it's a case of, does this change Germany's position within Europe, and therefore how Europe sees itself centered around Germany? Now, obviously, post-Brexit, the UK has left the EU, etc. But I think that we will see a reshaping of those sort of that power block within, and this is all down to how quickly can they resource the energy that they need and at what ultimate long-term cost. For me, that's pretty much the only simple conclusion that I can take in terms of the economics and the markets.
Let's actually keep a pin in that conversation, Jacob, because I had another question. What do you guys think are the primary causes, deeper causes of the war in Ukraine? Not the proximate causes, but the deeper causes. This has been like a huge sort of source of debate and argument on FinTwit. Not that FinTwit is where people should be having, well, people should have geopolitical conversations or political conversation anywhere. These are important subjects to talk about, but not that FinTwit is a measure of kind of the quality of conversation. But I'm curious what you guys think about that. What major sources cause this conflict?
Well, one of the reasons I thought that Russia was not going to invade Ukraine is because it doesn't make sense. I was wrong that Russia was not going to invade Ukraine, but I wasn't wrong about all the reasons I thought they wouldn't, because I didn't think they could win the war. I didn't think it was going to be Ukraine sort of counterattacking in the way that they had. I thought it was going to be an Iraq on steroids type scenario. It was a long-term insurgency that Russia was never going to be able to win. Russia was going to get isolated from the global economy. It was going to lose its European customers. You were talking about Germany just a second ago, Roger. If Russia lost this war, it will have done more for German foreign policy interests than any other country or leader ever has. They'll finally get to sort of conquer the Slavic regions, except they'll do it economically without having to fire a shot. Like, it's all these reasons why I didn't think Russia was going to do it. And which is why I think, however unsatisfactory it feels, is the real reason that Russia invaded Ukraine is relatively simple. Vladimir Putin wanted to. He thought that's what was in Russia's strategic interest. And I think he locked himself into a chamber in COVID-19 and isolated himself and just got this idea in his head that he needed to reintegrate Ukraine into the Russian Federation if Russia was going to continue as a great power. Russia has demographic issues, it has economic issues, it has so many issues that if you're just pushing pins around on a map and if you can get Ukraine back into the fold, it kind of makes sense. Then you can say you're the savior of the Russian people and the father of the modern Russian state and things like that. So I think it ultimately comes down to there was a political leader who had a significant amount of power, who saw things in terms of he thought that he could reintegrate Ukraine into Russia relatively easily, thought that what his generals told him about fixing all the problems from 2008 was real. And so he pulled the trigger because he didn't think that Ukraine was going to be able to defend itself. And by the way, he almost got everything right. The United States did not intervene. The first thing the United States did after the invasion was pull out embassy staff from Kyiv. The Europeans did not supply tanks and fighter jets to the Ukrainians. Nobody lifted a finger to help. The thing that Putin missed was that the Ukrainians were going to fight back. And once the Ukrainians showed that they could fight, suddenly the weapons came in and suddenly he had this bad situation on his hands. So that's a long way of saying I think it's a relatively simple answer. Russia invaded Ukraine because of Vladimir Putin. And it's really hard for geopolitics to manage that because that's not about mountains and rivers and geopolitical forces and this, that, or the other thing. It's about what one dude thought in his mind and what he had the power to do in a particular moment in time.
Roger, because I have a lot of thoughts. Go ahead, Roger.
Well, yeah, I'd be in the same camp as that because, remember, I think there's about 7 or 8 different versions of wide ranging from resources to borders to NATO. And none of them have made particular sense. None of them are rational, which again is probably why when you sit there rationally thinking about it in advance, it probably didn't make sense that it would happen. I think the power of one person's hand, I think that is the most plausible. But I mean, listening to Jacob put that forward there eloquently, if I had any views the other way, I've shifted towards his views on the back of it.
Yeah, I really like what you had to say. And I think it's so, it's a frustrating thing for me. I'm sure that it is for you guys and it's for all sorts of people. The way in which narratives take hold in the public mind and in the media, and they just have a force of their own. And then you find yourself often just kind of beating your hands against the wall or the door and nothing really seems to change people's views. But I completely agree. I mean, when the invasion happened, if Zelensky had fled Ukraine, if the Ukrainians hadn't actually stood up for themselves, the US and the Europeans wouldn't have reacted the way that they did. So I find the way in which people are framing this conflict as Zelensky being this like welfare queen and that, it's just some kind of corrupt Biden, Zelensky, Ukrainian, whatever. I mean, it's so much of what ends up happening in the way that we think about the war in Ukraine just gets filtered through the culture wars and through American domestic politics. So totally agree there. What do you think of the argument that it was NATO's expansion and continual expansion that ultimately was the cause that had NATO not expanded? Or maybe a more, I think, a better way to put this argument is it's less about NATO specifically, but about the eastward expansion of NATO, of the European Union, of democracy becoming a bigger plank of U.S. foreign policy. And I would add into that the real hard-on that America's foreign policy elite clearly had for Putin, going back to at least the Munich conference. I don't know why they had such a hard-on for him, and they kept kind of really pushing that angle. I would say needlessly antagonizing not just Putin, but they did it with Saudi Arabia as well. I mean, the time to antagonize Saudi Arabia would have been after the 9/11 attacks. I'm curious what you guys think of that. And I say that as someone that still has taken a very clear view and stated it because I think it's important that none of this excuses Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because a lot of time, what you see a lot on FinTwit is people saying, and this was also true ahead of the invasion, oh, this is Biden fear-mongering. There was that famous press conference of the press secretary at the DOD was being asked questions by some reporter about, well, what's your evidence that he's going to invade, and et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of people saw that like, this is warmongering by the Biden administration. We invaded Iraq. We're trying to do it again. But no. Russia invaded Ukraine. It was a giant F-up, as you said, Jacob. So I say that it's important, but I'm curious how you view that. Like, how much of what happened in 2014 and in 2022 is a result of, for lack of a better word, U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah. So we'll be careful. Don't get me on my soapbox about Saudi Arabia, because we'll be here for like 30 minutes and I'll be ranting and raving and none of you will get a word in. But just about before I answer that question, I just want to say a brief thing about Zelensky, which is I don't understand where this narrative is coming from about Zelensky being unimpressive or being the welfare queen. And I say that as somebody who grew up in rural Georgia, who was back in rural Georgia for some of the holiday. And when I'm driving around different farms and things like that, I'm always astonished because ever since the war started, I see them flying Ukrainian flags right next to the signs for Trump. And the Republicans in the last midterms, you could sort of feel that, we want to go after the Democrats for providing all of this money to Ukraine, and we're going to hit them on fiscal irresponsibility because they're, it's just this blank check to Zelensky, blah, blah, blah. And it was the first time that in a while where I just thought the mainstream Republican Party was way out of step, because when I go around to these places, they're flying Ukrainian flags. It's one of the only areas where I think there's agreement within the U.S. electorate. I'm recording with you now here from New Orleans. I see people flying Ukrainian flags in the French Quarter. I also see them back at home out on the farm. So there's some disconnect there that I don't quite understand.
Yeah, hold on with what you're going to say, because I think that's an interesting thing just to, if not explore, at the very least, just kind of close a loop on here. It's a very interesting observation. I don't know how much it is sort of virtual and how much it is in people's actual lives and people on the ground. I know that it's a big deal that guys like Tucker Carlson and other conservative voices have sort of attached themselves to this issue. It intersects, I guess, for me, everything is about culture wars in America. Everything is downstream from that. So because Zelensky was involved in some way with the Trump administration and Trump's kind of strong arming to try to get information on Joe Biden and his son's deal to serve on the board of Burisma. So I think a big part of it is that there's a lot of resentment over the Iraq War, the kind of resentment, for example, that you heard Trump rightfully stoke in the 2016 primaries during the Republican race when he torched Jeb Bush. I actually went back and saw that recently, and it's just incredible. I mean, I forgot truly how revealing that moment was, and it was just something that we weren't used to in American politics. And he said on a stage what so many of us just knew and believed. But that's another thing that's a problem in American politics today. And it's true, whether you're talking about Elon Musk or some of these other kind of tech bros, they point out hypocrisies. They point out things that, we all know, oh, this is bullshit. And then they somehow use that to generate support for themselves, even though they're kind of the same or worse. So that's a whole nother conversation. But go ahead. I interrupted you where we were, but go ahead with what you wanted to say.
So let's just go to the question about whether the expansion of NATO was ultimately responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's utter horseshit. And I don't normally take sort of black and white views. It's horseshit. I saw John Mearsheimer was sort of arguing a little bit of that, although I think his views were a little bit more nuanced than sort of media narratives credited him with.
They are. I mean, we had John on the show before the invasion and then afterwards again. And I do think his views have been I think it's also a tough thing for someone like John is the nuance gets kind of lost when you have an active invasion going on. But anyway, yeah, I
think his views are more nuanced, but the way he expressed his views was used to further that narrative about NATO expansion being the reason that Russia invaded. And it's not. The reason Russia invaded Ukraine is because Russia decided to invade Ukraine. Now, we can put all of that aside and say that Putin's propaganda about NATO expansion being the ultimate cause. We can put all that in a trash can and still say, if we're trying to get into the Russian strategic maker's mindset, Russia comes by its paranoia and its fears honestly. So if you want to go back every century for the last 4 centuries, there's a foreign power that invades Russia from the West and gets all the way to Moscow. So last century, it was Nazi Germany, almost completed the conquest, got bogged down in the winter. If they hadn't, maybe they would have taken Moscow. The century before that, it was Napoleon and his Grand Army. The century before that, it was Sweden. And in the 1600s, it was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So every single century, Russia gets invaded from the West. And the only reason Russia continues to survive is because those foreign powers get stuck in the Russian winter. They eventually wave the white flag because they can't complete the conquest and they go home. And then Russia expands outwards again because the longer that buffer zone is, the more time and the more resources it's going to take to get all the way to Moscow, and you can grind your enemies down in the Russian winter. So if you are a Russian strategic thinker, that's the history that you learn. That's what you're thinking about in terms of your greatest geopolitical threats. It's not like us in the United States where, oh God, we got hit by Pearl Harbor once, and then somebody, flew some planes into some buildings in a city once, and that was considered an attack. I mean, imagine real enemies who could conquer you, getting all the way to Washington, D.C. and burning it once a year for every 100 years going back a couple of centuries. That's the strategic mindset in Russia. So even though I reject all of that propaganda about, oh, it's NATO expansionism this, and it's the EU did this, and they promised us this, and they continue going forward, nonsense. But what's not nonsense is that any Russian leader, I don't care if it's Navalny or Putin or Winnie the Pooh, they are going to see that there's a threat from the West, and they need as much buffer space as they can because they know that in the long swath of history, somebody's going to come from Moscow at some point. That is the Russian strategic mindset.
Roger, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it's the sort of, the old story on Russia is its advantage, which is its size. It's also its disadvantage, which is the length of its borders and its fear of its borders, the fact that it always wants to protect its borders and it needs a buffer zone. That has been true throughout history. One of the reasons it has always wanted to expand is that it wants to have more safety from those external forces. And so I think that's always been the case. And as you say, through history, you can go back even further into the 1300s and 1400s, and you have similar sorts of stories. So that's part of the national psyche. And every leader, whether they've been communist or Tsarist or authoritarian today, they've always had that same view.
All right, so I'm going to move us into the second hour, guys. And I want to give our listeners a sense of kind of where this is going. Roger, we haven't had a chance to pick your brain on global macro yet. We're going to do that in the second hour. And I definitely want to talk about inflation, Fed pivot, all that good stuff. And I'd also be curious to ask you where that ranks next to these kind of bigger issues. Because we mentioned, Ukraine and the Fed seem to be kind of the two big issues, and they're so different. There's also so many kind of other countries and regions in the world to talk about. I definitely want to talk about the EU. Latin America is a subject that you don't hear often talked about, not even on this podcast. You guys have brought it up. You brought it up in this conversation. That's something else I want to talk about. China, of course. And we'll run out of time before we run out of topics. So for anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Roger and Jacob, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of this conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Guys, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.